It has become a common trait of world religions to take on wide variations in beliefs and modes of worship, at times far estranged from their foundational tenets. We recognize within pre- and post-schism Christianity thousands of denominations, and within Islam various sects of often impassioned differences. We sense that between these differences and those of all religions lie fundamental and more powerful truths that bridge across civilizations to construct an immovable divine presence that shrugs at national borders, dogmas, and history. But where predominant monotheisms are so often criticized for their fractioned status and the confusion they've wrought on spiritually inclined intellects and illiterate followers, the believers in the gods of ancient Greece do not appear to have had such a degree of intersectarian animosity. Greeks invoked the same Hellenic gods under very different lenses of interpretation. We have the sense of a curious Greek thinker plucking from a local grab bag of beliefs and worshipping at the temples of a god or gods dominant in their local region, without denying the divinity of a god across the countryside. This is due in part to there being no central authority for Hellenic religion, but rather a dispersed series of similar practices and gods that resembled one another more than they resembled the beliefs of non-Greeks. The mystery initiates of the goddesses Demeter and Cory, the worshippers of the Olympian Zeus, and the frenzied followers of Dionysus may have belonged to different religious worlds that existed alongside each other, providing later philosophers with a variety of systems and mythological legacies that became like uniquely colored fruits growing from the same tree. As Herodotus explained, the Hellenes worshipped at the same shrines with the same gods and practices in common. They also did not have any term for religion as we know it today. Plato refers to the stories in the age of the Titan Kronos in a manner that suggests a common source, which later splits off into misleading directions, somewhat perturbing the ability of later generations to piece it all together. Plato says, "Now all of these events rose from the same cause, and a multitude of others besides, more wonderful even than these. But through length of time, some of them have been suppressed altogether, and others have been told to us, scattered, each one apart from the other." As evident from Plato and the Pythagoreans, writings were circulating in the 5th and 4th centuries BC known to have been authored by Orpheus. Plato definitely had access to them, an access lost to the modern world. The first literary reference to Orpheus is in the 6th century BC, and it already refers to him as, quote, famous Orpheus, or Orpheus famous in name. Orpheus is not only viewed as the founder of a religious system, but also as a bearer of mysteries, esoteric doctrines, and rituals that he or his early followers may have brought in from elsewhere. Specific to this Orphic system is a rather famous cosmology that included the world egg or cosmic egg, from which the world was born. It is this situation and the God who shines forth from the egg that provides the subject for this essay. The Orphic egg was consecrated to Dionysus or Bacchus in his mysteries. Plutarch said it was an image of the universe, which engenders and contains everything. The Roman provincial philosopher Macrobius says, quote, "Consult the initiates of the mysteries of Bacchus, who honor with special veneration the sacred egg." Macrobius confirms this as a symbolic image of the world in this sense being the universal principle of all things. The Greek god Phanes, or Phanes, was the primordial deity of creation born from this egg, and he is known mostly to the enigmatic Orphics. Phanes sneaks into later traditions of Greek cosmology as king of the universe, god of primordial light, and a precursor to Nyx, Kronos, and Zeus. Phanes means to bring to light or to make appear. casting the god at once in the drama of the beginning of the universe. There aren't many surviving texts that mention the hermaphroditic Phanes. Later writers equated Phanes with other primordial gods, such as the elder Eros, Metis, Physis, Opion, and Thesis. Some comparative enthusiasts have drawn similarities between Phanes and the Persian concept of Zervan, whose depictions do at least bear a resemblance in their representations and descriptions, much as the Mithraic Kronos, worshipped in Rome in the 2nd century AD. See, for instance, the statue found in the Mithraeum of Ostia, dedicated by C. Valerius Heracles and his sons. Through the references of Plato and the Pythagoreans, among others, we recognize Orpheus as an esoteric persona, later mythologized, whose riddling writings and teachings rippled through later Greek cosmologies and informed Greek mystics on the immortality of the soul, the layered interpretability of symbols, and much more. The ancient Greek historian Diodorus Siculus points out the level of importance placed on the Orphica on par with the sacred mysteries. Quote, in agreement with this, it is pointed out, are the expositions in the Orphic poems, and the things which are introduced in the mysteries, the details of which it is not lawful to recount to the uninitiated. Pausanias, the Greek geographer in the 2nd century, also tethers the Orphic writings to the drama of the Eleusinian ritual, careful, as he always is, not to divulge their secrets. Quote, whoever has seen an initiation at Eleusis, or read the writings called Orphic, knows what I mean. When the Christian church father Clement of Alexandria proposes to quote a direct poem from Orpheus, the poem begins with more of this language of secrecy. I shall utter to whom it is lawful, but let the doors be closed, nevertheless, against all the profane. In Orpheus' appearance as an Argonaut on Jason's quest, we find him as an exponent of the magical effects of music, an art whose secrets were long held sacred to Pythagoreans. And in Orpheus' journey to the underworld to rescue Eurydice, his music is so divine that Hades concedes to Eurydice returning with him from the underworld. As we know, this goes tragically wrong when Orpheus looks back too soon. However, the tradition of Orphic cosmology, we will see, was well established. By at least the 4th century BC, we find an account of Orpheus singing about the origin of all things, of the birth of the world and the gods. It is Orpheus who was the only Argonaut who had already been initiated in the ancient mysteries at Samothrace, and recalls twice calling on the gods of those mysteries to save the ship from rough seas. Orpheus's mysterious connection with other Hellenic mysteries goes even further. In another testament to the Orphic influence on the mysteries of Bacchus, Algis Uzdavinys, the renowned translator of Greek and Egyptian texts into Russian and Lithuanian, writes in his book Orpheus and the Roots of Platonism, quote, the lyre and decapitated head of the murdered Orpheus were thrown into a river and floated across to the island of Lesbos. The temple of Bacchus was built on the spot where the singing and prophesying head of Orpheus was buried. The miraculous lyre had been dedicated at the temple of Apollo, and the singing head became famous as a giver of oracles and prophecies. This book frequently points out how the lineage of esoteric Greek theology and cosmology that filtered through Pythagoras and Plato stemmed from Orpheus, thereby reappointing Orpheus to his rightful place in world philosophy. Also, we find that Pythagoras, who was known to have written works that have not survived, published his lost writings in the name of Orpheus. Already by the 5th century BC, we have fragmentary references alluding to an Orphic religion with mystic rites set up around the god Dionysus. One reference to the Orphics comes from Plato in the Cratylus, when Socrates and Hermogenes are discussing the name of the body. Socrates says, thus some people say that the body is the tomb of the soul, on the grounds that it is entombed in its present life, while others say that it is correctly called a sign because the soul signifies whatever it wants to signify by means of the body. I think it is most likely the followers of Orpheus who gave the body its name, with the idea that the soul is being punished for something, and that the body is an enclosure or prison in which the soul is securely kept. When Plato presents a complex cosmology in the Timaeus, where towards the end he bases his sequence of named gods on the traditions of wise men, it is a Pythagorean Timaeus who presents the cosmology, and these wise men are given to be understood as followers of Orpheus. Since the Timaeus is the Platonic cosmology par excellence, and we suspect Orphic influence behind the scenes, we can examine the existing accounts of Orphic cosmology with some reflection on their potential importance, keeping in mind that some sources consider Orpheus as the one who named the gods and wrote his cosmology prior to Homer and Hesiod. The great example of this comes from a fragment from Athenagoras, a Christian apologist who wrote in the 2nd century AD. I quote it at length for the students of esotericism who are unsatisfied with summaries and would like to know the tradition up close. Athenagoras says, "The gods, as they say, did not exist from the beginning, but each of them was born just as we are born, and Orpheus, who was the original inventor of the gods' names and recounted their births and said what they have all done, and who enjoys some credit among them as a true theologian, and is generally followed by Homer above all about the gods, also making their first genesis from water, Oceanus, who is the genesis of the all. From water was according to him the origin of everything, and from hydros mud formed, and from the pair of them a living creature was generated with an extra head, growing upon it of a lion, and another of a bull, and in the middle of them a god's countenance. Its name was Heracles, and Kronos. This Heracles generated a huge egg, which, being filled full by the force of its engenderer, was broken in two from friction. Its crown became Aranos, and what had sunk downward, Gaia, earth. There also came forth an incorporeal god." Now this incorporeal god at the end is believed to be Protagoras and Phanes, which makes perfect sense if Athenagoras is actually relying on Orpheus or an Orphic writing for this cosmology. Take an earlier fragment from the philosopher Epicurus given by Epiphanius, which reads, "And he says that the world began in the likeness of an egg, and the wind encircling the egg serpent fashioned like a wreath or a belt then began to constrict nature. As it tried to squeeze all the matter with greater force, it divided the world into the two hemispheres. These hemispheres are likely heaven and earth, or Uranus and Gaia." From the Argonautica, we also have a fragment of the egg of this firstborn Phanes as Eros, where Chaos and Ananke and Kronos bred, quote, "within his boundless coils, Aether and two-sexed, two-faced, glorious Eros, ever-born, night's father, whom latter men call Phanes, for he was first manifested." And from the writer Nonus, many centuries later, in a Greek epic dated around the 5th century AD, Phanes returns as the most ancient of gods in the account of the safeguarding of Dionysus. In this tale, the wife of Zeus, Hera, was out to destroy Zeus's son, Dionysus, but, quote, "Hermes caught him up and carried him to the wooded ridge where Cybele dwelt. Moving fast, Hera ran swift shoe on quick feet from high heaven, but Hermes was before her and assumed the eternal shape of firstborn Phanes. Hera, in respect for the most ancient of the gods, gave him place and bowed before the radiance of the deceiving face, not knowing the borrowed shape for a fraud. So Hermes passed over the mountain tract with quicker step than hers, carrying the horned child folded in his arms, and gave it to Rhea. He put off the higher shape of self-born Phanes and put on his own form again, leaving Bacchus to grow a second time in the mother's nurture. The depiction of Phanes, the firstborn, can be seen in a Greco-Roman relief dated to the 2nd century AD. In it we see the hermaphroditic and winged Phanes enclosed in an egg, entwined by a serpent and encircled by the zodiac. The name Phanes as a bringer of light, or one that shone forth, is echoed in the Orphic hymn to Protagoras, which means first begotten. The hymn includes, "O mighty Protagoras, hear my prayer, twofold egg-born and wandering through the air, bull-roarer, glorying in thy golden wings, from whom the race of gods and mortals springs. The Lithuanian Algis Uzdavinys likens Phanes to the Egyptian god Autumn, who we find in the city of Egypt sacred to Thoth, who the Greeks equated with Hermes. This city, called Hermopolis, retained a cosmology of a cosmic egg in the watery chaos prior to creation, out of which the 8 gods of the Ogdoad are born. This is far from the only parallel of a cosmic egg found in a cosmology other than the one Orpheus appears to have brought into Greece. The Christian writer Eusebius, living in the 3rd and 4th centuries AD, testifies to the Phoenician cosmology through Philo-Biblius's reference to the Phoenician Sanchoniathon and his cosmology. Of course, Eusebius isn't in any mood to tolerate the accounts of heathens, and we wouldn't have known how faithfully he recorded this cosmology if it weren't for other writers corroborating him. We should remember that when Eusebius records the Babylonian traditions given by the historian Berosus, Eusebius would not have had access to the actual tablets that have come to the modern world, and have since vindicated Eusebius's faithfulness to the Babylonian historian Berosus. From this example, we have evidence of Eusebius's reliability. That said, I quote from this Phoenician cosmology as it appears in I.P. Cory's Ancient Fragments from the 1832 edition. If we were to take this cosmology at face value, it would actually stem from a time prior to the Trojan War, or about 1200 BC. Eusebius here tells us that the Phoenician Sanchoniathon supposes that the, quote, beginning of all things was a dark and condensed windy air, or a breeze of thick air and a chaos turbid and black as Erebus, and that these were unbounded and for a long series of ages destitute of form. But when this wind became enamored of its own first principles, and an intimate union took place, that connection was called Pothos, and it was the beginning of the creation of all things. And chaos knew not its own production, but from its embrace with the wind was generated mote, which some call Ilus, mud, but others the putrefaction of a watery mixture. And from this sprung all the seed of the creation and the generation of the universe. And there were certain animals without sensation, from which intelligent animals were produced, and these were called Zoophasimon, that is, the overseers of the heavens. And they were formed in the shape of an egg, and from mote shone forth the sun and the moon, the less and the greater stars. And when the air began to send forth light, by its fiery influence on the sea and earth, winds were produced, and clouds, and very great defluxions and torrents of the heavenly waters. And when they were thus separated and carried out of their proper places by the heat of the sun, and all met again in the air, and were dashed against each other, thunder and lightnings were the result. And at the sound of the thunder, the before-mentioned intelligent animals were aroused, and startled by the noise, and moved upon the earth and in the sea, male and female. These things were found written in the Cosmogony of Totus, and in his commentaries, and were drawn from his observations in the natural signs which by his penetration he perceived and discovered, and with which he has enlightened us. To add another late notice of Orphic cosmology, we look at the account of Damascius, who lived from 460 to 538 AD. Damascius was the last head of the Neoplatonic Academy in Athens. His work inspired a resurgence of pagan philosophy in Athens until the Christian Roman Emperor Justinian I shut down the academy and all other pagan institutions. Damascius appears to be using Orpheus's writings to relay this tale, and will find it faithful to those we've already read. To summarize, in the beginning there was water, or hydros, and mud, which the earth made solid. Water and earth being our first two principles, because Orpheus leaves silent the one before them all because of its ineffable nature. The third principle, Chronos, came after water and earth. It was time in the form of a serpent, with other heads growing out of it, of a bull and a lion, and, quote, a god's countenance in the middle. It had wings upon its shoulders, and its name was Chronos, and also Hercules. United with it was Ananke, being of the same nature, and Adrastia, incorporeal, her arms extended throughout the universe and touching its extremities. Damascus explains that with the other principles, like Aether and Chaos and Black Erebus, quote, among these, he says, Kronos generated an egg, this tradition too making it generated by Kronos and born among these, because it is from these that the third intelligible triad is produced. What is this triad, then? The egg, the dyad of the two natures inside it, male and female. Uranus and Gaia, heaven and earth, and the plurality of the various seeds between. And thirdly, an incorporeal god, with golden wings on his shoulders, bulls' heads growing upon his flanks, and on his head a monstrous serpent, presenting the appearance of all kinds of animal forms. And the third god of the third triad, this theology too celebrates as Protagonos. And it calls him Zeus, the order of all and of the whole world, wherefore he is also called Pan. So much this second genealogy supplies concerning the intelligible principles. It will be important to consider the relatively recent finding of the Derveni Papyrus. This is one of the oldest surviving Greek papyri, discovered near Thessalonica in 1962. This fragmentary Orphic commentary is of the rarest quality because it gives us a glimpse into the 5th and 4th centuries BC development of that philosophy influenced by a poem of Orpheus. The writer of the commentary presents a poem of Orpheus and includes commentaries and explanations, primarily of a theological and cosmological nature. I read from the comprehensive study on the Derveni Papyrus from the assistant professor of philosophy at the Central European University, Gabor Betegh. The broken beginning of this papyrus gives us tellings of daemons and assistant gods by its author, and mentions Heraclitus by name, who lived around 500 BC. Column 6 of the papyrus tells of magi performing rituals to remove avenging demons. The author writes in column 7, quote, his poetry is something strange and riddling for people, but Orpheus did not intend to tell them captious riddles, but momentous things in riddles. Indeed, he is telling a holy discourse from the first and up to his last word. But for the purposes of Orphic Cosmology, let us quote from Professor Gabor when he attempts to reconstruct it from the papyrus. Quote, the outlines of the Derveni author's cosmogonical theory are relatively clear. He distinguishes the present state of the cosmos from a previous pre-cosmic state. Before the current cosmic configuration emerged, there had been no independent entities with definite contours, but a cosmic mixture containing all the matter out of which the presently existing entities would later form. Then the cosmic mind separated the fiery particles, for he knew that it was the excessive heat of fire which did not allow independent entities to form. He fashioned the sun out of these fiery particles and placed it at a convenient location. Because the sun was still perilously large, he dispersed the surplus fiery particles and fixed them in the sky, thereby creating the stars. After the excess of heat had been removed, the sun could still communicate sufficient motive force in the form of heat to the rest to set different blocks of matter in motion. Entities could now separate, collide, and coagulate. This is the process through the world as we know it took shape. There is much more here, like the phallus of the firstborn king, being what the blessed gods and goddesses and the immortals grew on, which summons to my mind the lost piece of the Egyptian Osiris, having also been his phallus. Nevertheless, we have seen here how the Orphics are known for secret meanings in their myths from the pre-Socratic period and for their belief in a pre-cosmic god existing prior to the material universe. We have yet to exhaust all of the clues that point back to an Orphic tradition and Orphic mystics. We know Herodotus in the 5th century BC was making comparisons between the Orphic and Bacchic initiates to that of the Egyptians. To conclude, then, we look at the firstborn shining Phanes and wonder about the esoteric Greeks who carried the tradition of a pre-cosmic god existing prior to the heavens. We wonder if Phanes is one representation of the ineffable god of the mystery cults. This transcendent concept was left to the philosophers to refine by exhaustive means, but it may not have received too much public attention due to the restrictions placed on such teachings by the vowed secrecy of the mysteries and the general shadows into which the Orphic tradition vanishes. With this essay, I have conveyed the Orphic cosmology through references of its major sources. As I continue with occasional cosmological videos, I will also pause to review them as a whole and the clear similarities that consistently show up whenever the subject of the beginning of the universe and the gods is shared. Thank you for liking this video and subscribing to the channel. If you would like to support this work and help me provide more source-based teachings, consider supporting American Esoteric through the Patreon link in the description below. Thank you.